Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief. I'm Adam Lucente. Turkish Naval Forces Commander Admiral Ercüment Tatlıoğlu recently said that Turkey is seeking to join the club of nuclear submarine powers. The plan is for Turkey to develop the capability to power submarines with nuclear energy, turning the Turkish Navy into a global force with far-reaching capabilities. Such a process will take years, however, not to mention a significant increase in defense spending and the complications of developing nuclear power in a volatile region. In this episode, we hear from Al Monitor contributor Barin Kayaoğlu. Barin takes us through the reasons Turkey wants nuclear submarines, potential challenges in developing this capability, and how Turkish naval might compares to that of other countries in the Eastern Mediterranean. Hope you enjoy. Barin, welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief.
Thank you for having me, Adam. Good to be on the brief.
Yeah, thanks for joining and for your interesting analysis on this topic. My first question is, why is Turkey interested in nuclear-powered submarines? What are the benefits here?
Just to quickly give you a context, and we can sort of discuss this in greater detail. Turkey has been working on replacing some of its older surface vessels and surface combatants and submarines in recent years. Having a nuclear-powered submarine, and to be clear, this is a submarine with nuclear propulsion, not with nuclear weapons, and that's strictly the only thing that Turkey is interested at the moment. As to the why, there's several different sorts of benefits, and in military affairs, people often talk about prestige matters, especially with with the Turkish defense industry, and that's a given. But nuclear-powered submarines are peculiar in the sense that because of the specific engineering of it, the reactor has to be a bit bigger than diesel electric engines, so which means that it gives you a heavier tonnage, a bigger submarine, which means that you can put more sensors and more weapon systems, etc., onto them. And so that's the main benefit. As to the why, Turkey is increasingly interested in building what's called a blue water navy as opposed to a brown water navy. That's not a comment about the cleanliness of a particular sea, but a blue water navy is meant to denote a navy that can operate in the high seas and the open seas, further and further away from friendly ports. Because in the last 20, 30 years, Turkey has become a trading nation. It needs to make sure that its merchant marine, it's publicly owned, but especially privately owned trading ships are not harassed by potential cases of piracy or from the navies of other countries that might not be as friendly towards Turkey. Turkey wants to make sure that it has warships and it has task forces in places, especially like the Horn of Africa, and maybe down the road in a place like the Straits of Malacca, another place that used to be infested with modern day piracy. So broadly speaking, that's the aim, and a lot of what, if I may also quickly mention this, what prompted me to write my latest article was an interview between the commander of the Turkish Naval Forces, that's the Turkish equivalent of the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, and the prominent defense industry journalist and freelance researcher Cem Devrim Yaylalı, who wrote for the Britain-based Warships International Fleet Review. This is a prominent magazine. It was where Admiral Tatlıoğlu, Ercüment Tatlıoğlu, the chief of the Turkish Navy, mentioned that this is something we're looking into. This idea of having nuclear-powered submarines is something we're looking into, because it would give the Turkish Navy a much broader scope, a much broader range of operations. So that's the the how and the why and the what, if you will.
And what challenges might Turkey face as they seek to develop this capability?
There's several. The most important one seems to be the time. It takes a very long time to set up the infrastructure to produce nuclear reactors that can be fitted on submarines. And, having a civilian nuclear industry helps, which Turkey actually does, but it's very small. It's not the sort that Iran has or the type that Israel is suspected to have, or India and Pakistan, which have both civilian nuclear industry and also produce nuclear weapons. Nothing of the sort. Since the 1960s, Turkey has a small reactor outside of it. Well, it's now within Istanbul, within metropolitan Istanbul, on Lake Çekmece. It's called the Çekmece Nuclear Research Reactor. But for this sort of thing, you really need, and Turkey is working on some of this. The country's National Science and Technology Council is working on having nuclear reactors that can be adopted to serve on submarines. But doing this sort of thing takes a long time. First, you need to make sure that one, you're good at it, and two, you're basically not accident prone. That you have basically accident proof yourself, because one of the big things about nuclear technology today, aside from the risk of weapons proliferation, is accidents. Think Chernobyl, think Fukushima, those sorts of things. And I'm not too worried on that front when it comes to Turkey, because on the engineering stuff, especially the Turkish Navy, is really, really good. But it's really, all of this stuff is going to cost a long time, but it's going to cost a lot of money. I mentioned some of this in my article. Kozan Selçuk Erkan, a very prominent Turkish engineer and defense industry commentator, mentioned this. The U.S. Navy's Virginia class, I believe those are attack submarines. That is, they're meant to find and hunt other submarines underwater. Cost $2 billion a piece. Britain's most recent iteration of its nuclear power submarines cost $3 billion a piece. So these things, even though Turkish nuclear power submarines will be smaller, they're not going to be much cheaper in scale, even though Turkey can build a lot of things on the cheap because of the Turkish lira's relative weakness. There are also certain things that you just can't negotiate because of lower cost or currency fluctuations. You just have to spend that money. I think at present the Turkish naval forces budget goes about $10 to $12 billion, something of the sort. So you would need something a lot more than that to be able to afford submarines that go on nuclear propulsion. Those are some of the challenges I'm thinking about. Of course, to do all of that, you also need an independent nuclear fuel cycle, because it's not like a country is just going to give, ready to use uranium fuel rods or some other type of fuel rods. You have to produce a lot of this stuff yourself, but then you have to convince the international community that this is not like some sort of backdoor project into producing nuclear weapons. So that's going to be a huge challenge as the world gets more dangerous for Turkey, to convince the international community, to convince its neighbors that it's not seeking nuclear weapons.
And looking at the big picture, back to the naval angle, what is the current state of Turkish naval power? And how does it compare to other countries in the region, but maybe also the world as a whole?
Let's start with the region. It's a very good, that's a very good question. Thank you for that, Adam. It's regionally, it's pretty strong. Probably together with the French Navy, the Turkish Navy is the strongest in the Mediterranean. And the French Navy does have nuclear propulsion on its aircraft carrier. I believe it's also its flagship, the Charles de Gaulle. The Italians and Spaniards are pretty good. Obviously, these are traditionally very strong, naval. These countries come from strong naval traditions. But especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, there are only seconds to the Turkish Navy. It's the strongest, and it has this one advantage, which, because of over the years, a lot Turkey. This part is important. Turkey has started developing its indigenous production lines and its national supply chains for its navy. Going back to the late 1990s, the initial design started back then, and the first keel on a small corvette ship. This is about 3,000 tons. Started back in 2005, and that ship joined the force, I believe, around 2011. This is under Turkey's famous Milgem project, which stands for National Ship Project. It's a fairly straightforward name, but from that corvette, that 3,000 ton corvette, the Turkish Navy is now producing the I-class frigates, which have a displacement of about, I believe, 7,000 tons. And then down the road, in a couple of years, the Turkish Navy is going to start fielding the so-called TF-2000 anti-air warfare, that is air defense destroyers. Those are going to be even heavier. Meanwhile, well, with Spanish cooperation, Turkey rolled out its amphibious assault ship, TCG Anadolu. It's often called an aircraft carrier. It has aircraft on it, but it's not a dedicated aircraft carrier, say like the Nimitz class or the Ford class aircraft carriers that the U.S. Navy has. But Turkey did start earlier this year producing. It started cutting the steel, so to speak, for its dedicated aircraft carrier. At present, it's only called MUGAM, National. That stands for National Aircraft Carrier. But Anadolu refers to the Asian side of Turkey. So this one is expected to be called the TCG Trakya, after the Thracian region, the European part of Turkey. In terms of numbers, I wrote another article for Al Monitor. This was back in, I believe, September, about Turkey's naval ambitions. And so beside the Milgem project, Turkey is building different sorts of surface ships, including smaller patrol boats based on the Milgem design. But it's also under German license producing the Reis class submarines, which come with what's called air independent propulsion. That's the sort of propulsion system that enables a submarine that uses conventional diesel electric engines has to surface a couple of times a day. It's called snorkeling to get some air, to recharge its batteries, and then it can go back underwater. AIP, air independent propulsion submarines, such as the Reis, these are based on the German Type 214 designs, can stay underwater for days on end, up as much as 2 weeks, depending on usage. They can stay underwater for as much as 2 weeks, and that gives them a very, very powerful, deterrent role. So based on from the Reis class submarines, Turkey is going to roll out the national submarine project. It's called Milden, and a lot of folks expect that a lot of like many of the other Turkish defense industry projects, Turkey will be able to export its locally designed and locally manufactured submarines in international markets. So what we're looking at is building enough units to replace the aging fleet, but then build another 40 or as much as 50 new submarines and surface combatants by the middle of the century, really, by the 2040s. And the big question now for my most recent article is whether the nuclear-powered submarines are going to be part like a Mildan Plus, the National Submarine Project that comes also with nuclear propulsion, or it's going to be a completely different class of submarines that we don't know yet. We'll see, and there's a lot of there are a lot of unknowns on that front. And if we're talking about, of course, I'll conclude with this. If we're talking about Turkey, the Turkish defense industry, of course, we can't not mention drones. Turkey is also a very proficient use and developer of seaborne drones, both surface as well as underwater drones, and we're going to see a lot of movement on this front, some of which I allude to in this article. But for my article in September 2024, our listeners can find that one on Al Monitor. It's titled "What to Make of Turkey's Ambitious Naval Buildup." So yeah.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with Barin Kayaolu after this short break.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
Okay, we're back. Barin, my last question is about something you alluded to earlier. Would developing nuclear power for the purpose of submarines potentially lead Turkey to consider nuclear weapons in the future? Why or why not? What's your thinking on that?
I'll start with my personal opinion, which actually doesn't matter in the greater scheme of things, but just so that, our listeners know where I stand. I hope not. I hope it never comes to that. But, we live in an imperfect world, and these sorts of proliferation concerns are very, very valid. Now, there are good news and bad news on this front. I'll start with the good news. Turkish policy planners, strategic planners, national security bureaucracy people, whether they're civilian or whether they're in military, are not interested in nuclear weapons. Every time, the the conversation turns to these matters, proliferation. Obviously, Iran is a neighbor of us, of Turkey, and so it's always a concern of what might happen if Iran does go nuclear, how Turkey might respond, and so on and so forth. But everyone, it always harkens back to there's always a refrain here. We don't want to become Iran or treated like a pariah in international affairs. Nuclear weapons strategically don't really serve our purpose. So there's actually little to no interest in nuclear weapons, even though there is a little bit, even though on the one hand, Turkish public opinion is against developing nuclear weapons. Occasionally you hear folks in the commentariat, even journalists and columnists who advocate for at least developing the technology, which could be quickly snowballed into, could spill over into a nuclear program fairly quickly. But the decision makers are not interested in that. You hear this often. We do not want to be treated as Iran or North Korea in international affairs. So that's the good news. The bad news is, of course, we live in an increasingly dangerous world. And a lot of countries had to make this sort of Faustian bargain in the past of trading of their security for this ultimate weapon of mass destruction, which have become much more dangerous, much more powerful since the dawn of the nuclear age in 1945. And one of the good folks I cite in my article, I quote in my article, was kind enough to speak to me, a former Turkish Navy officer, retired Turkish Navy officer, Mr. Tayfun Özbek said, the one thing that deters another nuclear country from attacking your strategic facilities, your nuclear facilities, is the knowledge that you may have a nuclear powered submarine with nuclear missiles on it that you could attack them if they attack you. So it's ultimately called deterrence. During the Cold War, this was part of the so-called MAD theory, the mutual assured destruction. So down the road, if the world does continue upon its current course, I'm afraid future Turkish policy planners, defense planners, might opt for nuclear weapons. But in the here and now, in the year 2025, and for the next 5-10 years, I'm not too worried about Turkey going nuclear. So far, what we're going to see is just nuclear power plants and potentially nuclear propulsion on our submarines.
Barin, thanks a lot for your time, and we look forward to more of your analyses on these topics.
Thank you so much, Adam. Great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the Al Monitor Brief. Be sure to follow Al Monitor for more on the stories impacting the Middle East. Until next time, I'm Adam Lucente.